Good evening. My name is Karen Alworth, and I am delighted to welcome you to the College of St. Scholastica and to the first lecture in a series of 5 this year presented to you by the Alworth Center for the Study of Peace and Justice. Each year, we designate one lecture to honor my mother-in-law, Martha Alworth, and tonight's lecture is in her memory. Martha believed in peace, in justice, and in lifelong learning. And my hope tonight is that you will learn something new about justice and take a little piece in your heart with you when you leave tonight. Thank you for being here. And now it is my pleasure to introduce my friend and the director of the Alworth Center for the Study of Peace and Justice, Tom Morgan.
Thank you very much, Karen, and welcome all of you to the first of, as what Karen said, a whole series of programs. There's 5 that made it to this card, for sure, and the information about the other 4 programs are on this card. Some of these cards are out in the lobby, or we have a website. I mean, it's not a secret. We want you to know that there are 5 programs in this series, and in addition, we have a couple of other surprises, but I'll hold that for later. But this is the core of this season's program, these 5 lectures. These lectures are sponsored, of course, by the Alworth Center for the Study of Peace and Justice here at St. Scholastica, and they're funded in part by the Warner Lecture Series of the Manitou Fund, the DeWitt and Carolyn Van Ever Foundation, and the Mary C. Van Ever Foundation Endowed Fund in memory of William Van Ever, a former trustee of the college. Additional support has been received from the Royal D. Alworth Jr. Institute at the University of Minnesota Duluth, the UMD Department of World Languages and Cultures, Reader Weekly, and from numerous other private donors. And of course, the biggest donor of all are the Alworth family, who are right here, and I'm very grateful to them. If you want more information and aren't getting it or aren't on the mailing list, there are sign-up sheets in the lobby. And you can sign up for a postcard delivered to your house like this, or one like this, featuring each lecture, and you can put your email, or you can do both. And if you write your email in, of course, please be very precise. Otherwise, I won't be able to read it, and we'll get your email wrong. Also in the lobby, there are at least 3 organizations, community organizations, that are interested or promoting the idea of justice. They have tables in the back, in the lobby, and I invite you to witness them. In particular out there, I just want to call attention to one of many things that are out there, but there are flyers about this program on restorative justice, which is slated for Saturday, October 12th at the monastery. I'm going to spare you all the rest of the details, but you're all welcome, and the information is on a flyer like this, and it's out there. Or, if you can't find a flyer, the person in charge is Ted Lewis, and I think he's in the audience. Is Ted Lewis here? I saw him. Well, there he is. Where is he? Well, take a bow. Let him see who you are, so that if you want to go to that seminar, that's the guy you talk to, and he'll be here. After this lecture, and early next week, we gather for our regular talkback sessions where we take apart everything you're going to say and analyze it. And the person facilitating that is my colleague of long-standing tenure here at the college, Steve Ostovich. Here's information about that, Steve's credentials, and I think he'll be paying attention to your lecture in particular. He'll facilitate the discussion. You'll notice it's at 6:30, not 7 p.m. We're trying that early start time and see how that works. After the lecture, after Professor Kelly makes her remarks, then of course you're welcome to ask questions. I encourage you to ask questions. I learned with her again today all about Socrates and how important dialogue is in really getting to the truth. So you only can do that if you come to these microphones after the lecture and ask questions. Community people, please defer to the students. Let them ahead of you, because they sometimes have the most interesting questions of all, don't they? If you have cell phones or other devices, please turn them off now, if you haven't already. On the screens in front of me, or to my left and right, we're displaying the text of tonight's lecture through technology called real-time captioning. Although we anticipate a high-quality format, there will inevitably be errors that are inherent to the technology. A special thank you to the Edwin H. Eddy Foundation, whose generous support makes this inclusive service possible tonight. Our speaker this evening grew up in Rochester, Minnesota. She was seemingly destined for medical or law school and riding horses or being kicked by horses. Somehow that didn't happen, except for the part about the horses. Instead, she studied philosophy, earning her Ph.D. from Harvard University and getting a job at Tufts University, where she is today. Her research interests are in moral and political philosophy and the philosophy of law, with a focus on questions about justice, the nature of moral reasons, moral responsibility, deserved reward or punishment, and theories about punishment. Her book, published last year, calls for making a distinction between blame and guilt in our criminal justice system. The title of the book is The Limits of Blame, and this will be on sale in the lobby after the program. She's also helped edit Collective Responsibility and Social Ontology, which came out this spring, and she is the editor of one of the last works of the famed moral philosopher John Rawls. The name of that book is Justice is Fairness, a Restatement. Currently, she's putting the finishing touches on a book about African-American artist Winfred Rembert, whose 7 years on a chain gang are reflected in his art. She's exploring the public nature and social role of criminal law in another project, and she's beginning work with a colleague at Tufts that explores forgiveness as a civic virtue. She's the author of numerous academic papers and presentations, of course. Her teaching includes courses in the philosophy of law, philosophy of criminal justice, and recently the political philosophy of Martin Luther King Jr. Currently, she's teaching Introduction to Philosophy to male prisoners in a state prison in Massachusetts. She spends her free time enjoying music, film, the great outdoors, and keeping up with two teenage daughters, Iman, 19, and Raya, 17. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Erin Kelly.
Thank you for that warm introduction. I really appreciate it. And it's such an honor to be here and to be part of the Alworth lecture series, which looks to be very interesting. Looking ahead to the other speakers, and it's my pleasure to be a part of it. I'd like to thank Tom Moran for inviting me here and giving me this opportunity to share my thinking with you about the topic of justice. I'd like to thank President McDonald and Royal and Karen Alworth for the role they played in hosting me for this event today. It's been a really great day so far, and a lovely dinner before the talk. So I was asked to speak about the question, what is justice? And what I've decided to do is to talk about what a number of philosophers throughout history have had to say about the topic, and I'll add some of my own thoughts along the way about how to think about justice. And I'm hoping that it will offer you some frameworks that you can use for organizing your own thinking about the topic of justice and pursuing some of your own thoughts about it And I look forward I hope that you'll share some of your thinking with me during the discussion at the end of my talk. So, what is justice? Plato's Republic is the first philosophical treatise on the topic of justice. It was written as a dialogue between real persons who lived in Athens, Greece, in the 5th century BCE. The central character is Socrates. Socrates encounters various figures around the city, and he questions them about what they know. In particular, he challenges them to define justice. Several characters try their luck. No easy task. At an early moment in the dialogue recalls the poet Simonides, who was greatly admired and reputed to be a wise man. Simonides is reported to have said, let's go to him, "It is just to give each what is owed to him." The idea that justice involves giving to each what is owed to him has its appeal, and Plato himself seems drawn to it. It seems to capture the fairness, balance, and sensitivity of justice. But how exactly are we to make sense of Simonides' principle? What could be owed as a matter of justice? Goods, opportunities, recognition, rights, rewards, punishment? And what affects who is owed and how much is owed? Does justice respond to a person's contribution, need, moral status, inheritance, talent, behavior? Philosophers have debated these difficult questions. Simonides' principle is abstract, and if it is attractive, as some characters in Plato's dialogue seem to think it is, it requires interpretation. In Book 1 of the Republic, Polemarchus is eager to offer insight. Justice involves benefiting your friends, he says, and harming your enemies. He's immediately challenged by Socrates and other characters in the dialogue to refine his understanding to correct for possible bias. After all, what if, unbeknownst to me, my friends are bad people who ought to be my enemies? In that case, how could it be just to benefit them? Polemarchus quickly refines his definition. Justice involves benefiting your friends, he says, provided that they really are good people, and harming your enemies, provided that they're bad. One aspect of Polemarchus's proposal is his affirmation of the value of loyalty. But loyalty bears a tenuous relationship to justice, since loyalties are too often tribal and divisive, and justice purports to be impartial. In that respect, Polemarchus's thinking is provincial. But in another respect, his interpretation of Simonides' wisdom moves in the direction of an idea that's surprisingly modern. What he proposes is close to the idea that the aim of justice is to confer benefits on the good and burdens on the bad. So we skip over loyalty and arrive at the idea that justice is connected with the notion of moral desert. Justice requires that people get what they deserve. Good people deserve praise and other benefits. Bad people deserve to be blamed and harmed. It's a familiar idea, and many people are drawn to it. There's a vast literature in philosophy on praise and blame, how these notions should be understood, and why they're supposedly essential to morality. According to some philosophers, praise and blame are fundamental. They are bedrock notions, so to speak. Good, bad, right, wrong, and justice are all understood in relation to what and who is worthy of praise or blame. A good person who acts well deserves praise and benefits. A bad person who does wrong deserves blame, condemnation, and negative consequences, including punishment. Justice is served when deserved benefits and burdens are delivered. So let's call this the notion of just deserts. So on this way of thinking, justice is something we build up from a foundation of praise and blame. I disagree with the importance moral philosophers assign to praise and blame, especially when it comes to thinking about justice. I reject the idea that justice is a matter of allocating just deserts, and I'll try to explain why. To begin with, what's notable here in the modern preoccupation with who deserves what is the centrality of the notion of individual responsibility, a notion that's murkier than proponents of blame can afford to admit. Contemporary moral philosophers believe that what people deserve is determined by how they act and who they are, or more precisely, according to this popular view, how people act determines who they are and what they deserve. The idea is that we make ourselves into the particular persons we turn out to be by endorsing reasons, values, and attitudes, good or bad, that are in effect the principles of our action. This process of self-constitution defines our moral status and determines what we deserve. A person who cares too much about money and organizes his life around the pursuit of it is greedy and deserves scorn. A person who disrespects others' property rights and helps herself to their possessions is a thief who deserves not only disapproval, but also harsh treatment. The point is that the principles of action we endorse through our conduct and what those principles reveal about who we are determines how we deserve to be treated by other people. The best student deserves the highest grade, the better team deserves to win the trophy, morally good people deserve admiration and praise, a criminal offender deserves punishment. So understood, a focus on moral accountability is central to contemporary philosophies of criminal justice. Criminal justice concerns how legal institutions should respond to people who have violated criminal laws. The focus of most philosophies of criminal justice is the practice of punishment. Theorists attempt to answer questions such as, what is the aim of punishment? What forms of punishment are acceptable and why? When are we permitted to punish? When are we required to punish? The most popular philosophy of criminal justice today centers on the notion of retributive justice. The retributive principle affirms that criminal wrongdoers deserve to be harmed in proportion to their blameworthy wrongdoing. So you have two components. There's the wrongdoing, and then there's the blameworthiness of the person for the wrongdoing. And when you have both elements present, wrongdoing and blameworthiness, there's a call for, justice calls for retribution. Justice demands retribution, according to this philosophy. So the retributive philosophy stresses a connection between the notion of moral desert and the value of retribution. In more colloquial terms, it buys into the logic of payback. I think there are many problems with the retributive theory as an account of criminal justice, and I'll focus on three of them. The first concerns the practice of criminal justice. Come on, slide. Okay, here we go. Our system of criminal justice is characterized, I think, by a misalignment between the practice of punishment and evaluations of moral blameworthiness. People who are more likely to get caught up in the criminal justice system tend not to be the people who are plausibly thought to be the most morally blameworthy. For example, mental illness is rampant among the prison population. Intellectual disability is also thought to be more prevalent, among the prison population than among the non-prison population, though there doesn't seem to be much good data on that question. Mental illness and intellectual disability are morally mitigating factors. They compromise a person's moral responsibility, according to many paradigms for thinking about the nature of moral responsibility that philosophers have developed. But with a few exceptions, the law does not treat them as mitigating factors. So consider some cases you might read about in law textbooks. Eric Clark shot and killed a police officer. As you know, our society demands the harshest penalties, often life in prison or death, for crimes like his. He was convicted of first-degree murder and received a life sentence. In 2006, the United States Supreme Court heard his appeal. Why? Because when Eric Clark pulled the trigger, he was desperately trying to defeat what he took to be a dangerous space alien. He was suffering from serious paranoid schizophrenia. The Supreme Court acknowledged Clark's delusional schizophrenia, but it affirmed his conviction and life sentence. It ruled that his psychosis was irrelevant to determining whether he intended to kill a human being. Hence, his psychosis did not mitigate his guilt. Now consider Sharon Patterson's case. She was caring for a 2-year-old boy who was not her son. When he wet his bed, she decided to stop giving him water in the evening. He also sometimes refused solid foods. To get him to eat, she decided to restrict his water during the day as well. Withholding water from a child is a dangerous thing to do, and as a result, the boy died. Sharon Patterson was charged with criminally negligent homicide, found guilty, and given 10 years in prison. It is also the case, and presumably relevant to morality, that Sharon Patterson is intellectually disabled. She didn't understand the harm she was doing. She thought she was helping. The court recognized that she didn't understand the danger of her actions, but it upheld her conviction on the basis that a reasonable person would have. Her disability did not mitigate her criminal guilt. What about a person who steals to support a drug addiction? Over 2 million people are afflicted by an opioid disorder in the United States today. Many crimes, and by some estimates, the vast majority of all felonies, are related to drug and alcohol dependence because they're committed by people who are either under the influence or seeking to support an addiction. But addiction does not mitigate punishment for any crime. Or consider the thousands of cases in the United States of people sentenced to life in prison for crimes they committed as juveniles. Studies show that childhood abuse and neglect increase criminal delinquency by at least 40%. That truth, however, mitigates neither guilt nor punishment. Our legal system has decreed that people such as these are legally culpable. Though the personal hardships of mental illness, trauma, and addiction represent problems that would be difficult for most people to manage well, none of them mitigates the law's assessment of criminal culpability, or not much. The same holds true for the limitations of intellectual disability and immaturity. Short of the extremes of mental illness that qualify as legal insanity, the vast majority of mentally ill, intellectually disabled, traumatized, addicted, and immature people are ruled criminally guilty when it has been established that they've committed criminal acts. Mental illness, intellectual disability, trauma, and addiction may diminish moral blameworthiness, but they do not mitigate criminal guilt. I think it's hard to make ethical sense of these legal results, at least if we buy into a retributive theory of justice. At the very least, they pose a serious challenge to the notion that moral retribution fits the law, fits our practices. Defenders of a retributive philosophy might respond by claiming that we need to make some adjustments to our criminal justice practices. They might argue that our criminal justice system does not now deliver just desserts, but it could if we were to reduce the sentences of teenagers and people afflicted with mental illness or addiction and those who are intellectually disabled. Actually, the courts have expressed some sympathy with these ideas, at least when it comes to the very harshest penalties, specifically the death penalty and life without parole. The U.S. Supreme Court has ruled that the death penalty is unconstitutional when applied to juveniles or the mentally ill, and that juveniles cannot receive mandatory sentences of life without parole. Defenders of a retributive principle might also posit that we should go easier on people with substance addictions. The devastating opioid epidemic has increased public sympathy for a less punitive approach to the crimes of addiction. Now that addiction is no longer imagined to afflict only the ghetto poor, it has become a cause of public outcry. For example, the Attorney General of the state of Massachusetts, where I live, is currently suing the corporate pushers of prescription painkillers on behalf of the public. So it might be thought that by punishing less and more selectively, we will have a chance to deliver retributive justice. Yet reforming the law to better fit the requirements of retributive justice will be difficult, if not impossible, to achieve because some disturbed people are dangerous and threaten our rights. Though we are certainly too quick to think incarceration is the best response to criminal wrongdoing, legal consequences of some sort are important when people harm others. A non-retributive approach to punishment maintains that we owe it to victims and potential victims to incapacitate, deter, and rehabilitate people who have demonstrated a willingness to violate the rights of others. Deterrence, incapacitation, and rehabilitation, however little it may be practiced right now, are plausible reasons to punish. Acknowledging the seriousness of crime, recognizing the harm victims have suffered, and seeking to prevent further violations requires serious steps that may include imposing burdens on criminal lawbreakers to discourage and prevent them from committing crimes. While some people are so impaired that efforts to deter them can have no rational influence, that's not true of all people, all of the people who are morally impaired. Furthermore, incapacitation may be effective when deterrence is not, and medical treatment and other alternatives to incarceration are promising in many cases. While treatment programs are not what we traditionally think of as punishment, requiring them can be a reasonable response to criminal behavior. Deterrence and rehabilitation, while difficult to achieve, are plausible reasons to punish. Yet these consequence-sensitive rationales move us away from retributive thinking. It's no longer moral desert, but rather the importance of measures to enhance security for our rights that call for the use of punishment or other interventions. So understood, the use of punishment is guided by its possible benefits, greater protection for basic rights. Its use would be permissible on this non-retributive approach only when it is, in this way, successful, and at an acceptable price, a price that includes the harm punishment does to those who are made to suffer it. But there's no justice in punishment per se on this line of thinking. Once we abandon the model of just deserts, there's no justice in punishment per se because harming criminal offenders is not a good or an act of justice in itself. It's good only when it produces beneficial consequences. Let me now turn to a second objection to the retributive theory. In talking about individual responsibility and desert, I've left Polemachus behind. Recall Polemachus's insistence that a just person would benefit good people and harm bad people. We discussed the connection between this proposal and the modern notion of moral desert and retribution. But the Greeks didn't have a modern notion of individual responsibility with its focus on moral desert. Socrates was dissatisfied with Polemachus's idea for a different reason. He was of the view that harming unjust people makes them worse. Socrates asks, how could it ever be just to cause greater injustice? He maintains it could not be. A just person, he thinks, would never intentionally cause greater injustice. So Polemachus is wrong about what justice demands. Justice could not require harming bad people when doing so would make them worse. We might ask ourselves Socrates' question, given how we treat people who are condemned to prison. As it's practiced today in the United States, incarceration is extremely harsh and dehumanizing. Prison hurts and permanently alienates people. Those who are let out of prison have great trouble finding jobs and readjusting to life in society. It's extremely difficult for them to succeed at making a decent life in society, if and when they're released. Not surprisingly, recidivism rates are high. So how could it be just to harm people and make them worse? Why are we so invested in the punishment industry? Do we have a good response to Socrates' challenge? Socrates claims he does not know how to define justice, but he observes that injustice, however exactly we define it, causes war, conflict, and fighting, while justice brings friendship and a sense of common purpose. On this way of thinking, justice is not a matter of assigning individual responsibility and calculating praise and blame. It's a social order, a peaceful order that serves a common purpose. Justice is an overall state of society. It's a collective achievement. This idea of justice as a peaceful and mutually beneficial social order fits contemporary discussions in philosophy of the notion of distributive justice. According to Plato, justice is a peaceful and mutually beneficial social order. Distributive justice is a virtue of institutions. Social institutions, including government, law, an educational system, and the economy, are just when they distribute relevant social goods, whether those be rights, liberties, opportunities, wealth, or income, in ways that are mutually beneficial and fair to all of society's members. Justice requires that goods be distributed in ways that are fair to all of society's members. Each member of society is entitled to the rights, liberties, opportunities, income, and wealth that, within reason, would enable that person to pursue her favored life course. Or, to put the point in another way, each member of society is entitled to a scheme of basic rights, liberties, opportunities, and material goods that is compatible with the equal claims of other people. So we've come back around to Simonides' idea that justice involves giving to each what is owed to him, but through the concept of distributive justice rather than through the notion of retributive justice. Each member of society gets what he or she is owed by justice through a fair distributive scheme. John Rawls was an important 20th century political philosopher. His seminal work, A Theory of Justice, was published in 1971. The notion of distributive justice Rawls develops in that work, he calls justice as fairness. He contrasts it with the idea that justice is a matter of conferring deserved benefits and rewards. Rawls argues that justice can't be a matter of moral desert because distributive outcomes depend on many factors we can't possibly be said to deserve. We don't deserve our birthplace in the social order and the advantages it inevitably confers upon us, nor do we deserve our place in what Rawls refers to as the natural lottery. That is, we don't deserve our natural talents, abilities, psychological dispositions, or aptitude for mental and physical health, just as we don't deserve the parents we happen to have, the social class we're born into, or the good or bad luck that befalls us. Yet all of these factors influence our life chances. They make a difference to how well a person can expect to do in society. The difference that social position and natural characteristics make to a person's life chances is most striking in an unjust society where there are few bounds to the rewards that the advantaged are able to leverage for themselves, and where poverty and racial subordination severely curtail even the most hardworking and talented person's opportunities. Yet even in a just society, attributes like intelligence, creativity, beauty, family support, and health, which are at least partly undeserved, will influence how well a person can expect to do in the course of his or her life. Acknowledging this, Rawls concludes that the distribution of rewards for social and natural advantages should not be thought of as a matter of allocating desert. He took what many people would regard as a radical position. A distributive scheme should be to the mutual advantage of all members of society, including the least well-off. Even more than that, Rawls argued, any inequalities in the distributive scheme should be to the greatest benefit of the least advantaged when compared to other possible distributive schemes. For example, attaching greater rewards to some positions, say positions of leadership and responsibility, is justifiable because it creates incentives for the talented to develop their talents to the benefit of all, including the less talented. We all benefit from good doctors and thoughtful political leaders, and their higher salaries, such as they are justified to the extent and only to the extent that the least well-off benefit more from this inequality than under more equal income distribution schemes. That was Rawls' idea. In other cases, rewards might be used to motivate people to accept jobs that are especially unappealing. Someone needs to clean up the toxic waste. Sufficient compensation might make the job worthwhile to some people. Rawls argues for the conclusion that a distributive scheme should be to the greatest advantage of all members of society, especially the least well-off, by imagining which principles of justice would be chosen if people charged with the task of choosing principles of justice were situated behind what he calls a veil of ignorance. He calls this notion of justice, the one that would be chosen behind a veil of ignorance, justice as fairness. So the idea is that justice as fairness is this notion that would be chosen behind the veil of ignorance. A veil of ignorance is designed to screen out people's knowledge of their own social position, gender, race, talents, religious beliefs, and other personal characteristics, thus making it impossible for anyone to design principles to benefit themselves in particular. Parties to this imagined social agreement are instead forced to choose principles that they would find acceptable from any social position, since, behind the veil, they're forced to reckon with the possibility that any of the various possible social positions could turn out to be their own. They must make a choice that's fair to everyone. From a position of ignorance, Rawls reasons, no one would rationally choose the desert principle. Instead, the parties would agree to something much closer to equal distribution. Suppose we accept a broadly Rawlsian paradigm for thinking about distributive justice and agree that all members of society should be guaranteed equal basic rights, liberties, and opportunities, and a level of material wealth and income that makes a decent life possible, at least that. Might there be a more limited role in a just society for the notion of individual responsibility, the notion that was so central in the desert paradigm? Here's a possible line of thinking, suggested by Rawls. It's the responsibility of institutions to distribute goods and opportunities fairly. It's the responsibility of individuals to act well. Institutions and individual persons are each held to the relevant standards. Institutions should function justly, and when they do not, they should be reformed. People ought to comply with just laws, and when they do not, punishment may be used to motivate compliance. People who violate their obligations to society should face consequences that are designed to restore a just social order. So let's call this corrective justice. According to a corrective justice paradigm, individual responsibility is understood in relation to the demands of a just social order. Punishment aims to advance justice, understood as a fair distributive scheme for mutual benefit. Someone who disregards the law and violates another person's rights should be persuaded through the imposition of negative consequences or other strategies to influence behavior that complying with just law is in his or her interest. Rawls and Plato are aligned in this argument. Punishment aims to advance justice, understood as a cooperative scheme. In the Republic, Plato develops the idea of justice as a cooperative social order. As the dialogue unfolds, he portrays the just city as one in which each class of people does its part to preserve and enhance the justice of the whole city. He thinks those who do not should be compelled. There's a rationale for the practice of punishment, but not to realize an ideal of retributive justice. Rather, Plato imagines punishment to function as a form of instruction. Those who are willing to break the laws are educated through the legal consequences they face to abide by their better nature. Only in this way does Plato think we avoid the problem of making the unjust person worse, which, as I've mentioned, he thinks would be at odds with justice. So Plato's approach to criminal justice makes no use of the retributive principle. There's no role for the value of retribution. Instead, the point of punishment is to rehabilitate, deter, and educate. The success of punishment is measured by its consequences, by whether those who have been punished are less likely to violate society's rules and more likely to contribute constructively to it. Wrongdoers should be restored to their proper place in society. There's no claim here about the intrinsic value of giving a bad person the suffering he morally deserves. Instead, criminal justice is designed to contribute to an overall just social order, which involves fundamentally acknowledging and protecting the basic needs and potentialities of all members of society. Criminal justice belongs to a collective effort to achieve a peaceful order that serves the common good. I find Plato's effort to understand the point of criminal justice in relation to matters of overall distributive justice attractive. The criminal justice system does not have an independent and self-contained moral rationale. We need not organize either morality or justice around the idea that good people receive benefits and bad people deserve to be harmed, as if we could even make good sense of that idea. Rawls is right to point to the moral significance of contingencies that affect a person's life chances. These contingencies affect the development of personhood, including what a person counts as good reasons to act in one way or another. How we act is the product not only of who we are, but of all the factors that have shaped us into the people we have become. Plato's view of the importance of education, role models, and practicing virtuous behavior acknowledges this, as does Rawls's discussion of the many contingencies influencing a person's life chances. If this is correct, a criminal justice system should be designed to enhance a just distributive scheme. Punishment is justified by, and only by, its likely consequences for establishing a just social order. Justice never involves intentionally doing something that causes greater harm. I've been discussing reasons to regard both Plato and Rawls's notion of justice as contrasting sharply with popular notions of retributive justice. But I haven't yet attended to an important difference between them. Plato was no fan of democracy. He defended a hierarchical social order in which the city is ruled by philosopher kings and ordinary people do only the work for which they are most suited, whether that is building, weaving, baking, or farming. The operative notion of personal responsibility in Plato's philosophy is tied to differentiated and hierarchically defined social roles. The objective of the practice of punishment, Plato thought, was to enable a society to function well, and this requires maintaining a rigid social order in which different classes of people are each constrained to their natural place. When that order is disturbed, punishment functions to restore it. In Plato's vision, human society has a telos, or perfect end state, which he understood to be a state of human flourishing. Each member of society is to play his or her part in a social script that enables the whole society and each person in it to flourish according to their nature and abilities. A modern liberal democracy has no telos, and it rejects prescribed social roles. Rather than a shared notion of the good or human flourishing, it's organized by something like a commitment to equal freedom and fair opportunity, at least in theory. No one is to be coerced to adopt any particular notion of life's meaning or purpose. A modern liberal society is pluralistic. It displays a diversity of ideas about what makes life worth living. Because there's no shared idea of the human good, a just order is oriented around the protection of equal basic rights and liberties, opportunities, enabling people to pursue their own values and priorities. That's the liberal idea. Accordingly, a liberal political philosophy, one that's suited to a modern, pluralistic, and democratic society, cannot understand criminality as the violation or refusal of a prescribed social role. Punishment is not designed to force people back into a social position to which they are best suited as measured by the overall good of society, much less to the margins of society where they may be vilified and discarded. Criminality is a threat to a just order of equal basic rights and liberties. In a democratic society, each person is obligated to respect the rights and liberties of other people. There is an important notion of individual accountability connected with this obligation, and it's defined by reference to the possibility of a just social order, but not one that can be understood as an organic whole in which different classes of people are assigned complementary roles by nature or determined to be unworthy of any social position. This point can be made more abstractly. A consequence of embracing a liberal principle of equal basic rights, liberties, and opportunities for all is that punishment cannot be understood simply as an instrument useful for promoting the common good. It's not enough that punishment has instrumental value in relation to the good of the whole. In a democracy, coercive actions by the state must be justifiable to each person. The state's claim to legitimacy must be acceptable from all points of view, including the perspective of those who are least well off. The practice of punishment is also subject to this evaluative test. This points to a serious problem for the practice of criminal justice in an unjust social order. People who are more likely to be caught up in the criminal justice system are not only those who suffer from mental illness, disability, or addiction. They are people who are economically, politically, and socially disadvantaged. They are people who have not enjoyed the benefits of equal membership. In fact, the problem of crime itself is connected with the injustice of people not getting what they're entitled to. Poverty, alienation, and unfair treatment drive the crime rate up. This reality undercuts the retributive thesis, which is my third argument against it. The role the state plays in creating or sustaining the conditions that foster crime undermines the standing the state has to blame criminal wrongdoers. The state shares responsibility for the problem of crime, and it evades that responsibility when it acts as though criminal justice is solely a matter of allocating individual responsibility and desert. Punishment in the United States is harsh. Convicted felons are subjected not only to the indignity of incarceration, they're saddled with the stigma of a criminal record and the social marginalization and exclusion connected to that stigma. These are severe burdens to impose on anyone, but especially on persons who have not enjoyed the benefits of equal membership. If punishment is calibrated to increase the justice of the social order, as I've argued it should be, those who bear its burdens can rightfully object if they have not and are unlikely to enjoy the benefits a punishment system aims to produce. They can rightly object because the burdens they're forced to bear are fundamentally unfair. If punishment is permissible to enhance the justice of the social order, it must be to the benefit of all, including those who are least well off. Those who are liable to punishment must agree, at least in theory, that liability to punishment for criminal wrongdoing is a reasonable price to pay for the benefits of the protection of law. We could imagine agreeing to that, possibly, under a veil of ignorance. In other words, Liability to punishment is justifiable when it's justifiable when it's a reasonable price to pay for the benefits of the protection of law. Those who do not receive law's protection and do not enjoy the rights and liberties to which they are entitled by law and justice would have no reason to enter the social agreement. Punishing people who have not received the benefits of law is fundamentally unfair. So in conclusion, once we reject the aspirations of retributive justice, as we should, we must also recognize that we cannot achieve criminal justice without a commitment to distributive justice. The practice of criminal justice is legitimate only for its contribution to the possibility of a democratically just society. Otherwise, it is seriously compromised in ethical terms. And this is seen most clearly by those who are most harmed by it. Thank you.
All right, let's start the Socratic Dialogue. Please come down and with your questions.
I welcome your questions, also thoughts, if you have
Come
thoughts
down
to
to the
offer.
microphone, please. Here comes one.
Hi.
Hi.
I was just wondering if you could further expound on how you would respond to the notion that certain forms of punishment, such as the death penalty or prison time, could be used to serve as a deterrent to keep society from committing crimes.
Yeah. So there are two ways to think about deterrence. They're sometimes referred to as specific deterrence and general deterrence. General deterrence is you treat somebody in a certain way to deter other people. Specific deterrence is you treat somebody, you impose some penalty on somebody to discourage them from committing the crime again and to get them to change their motivation. Now, general deterrence is harder to justify because it looks like, well, we're harming one person in order to get other people to do something different. So it's a kind of difficult argument to accept. But that's got to be the only relevant notion of deterrence when it comes to the death penalty, right? Because the person is gone. There's no specific deterrence anymore. And life in prison, same thing, right? I think it's a hard argument to make successfully. The more appealing notion of deterrence is specific deterrence. Namely, somebody pays a penalty for having done something they're not supposed to do, and then the aim is to get them not to do it again. So, it's a good question.
Sheldon Watts, historian, comment. Here in Duluth, we have a test case. The chapter burnt down the synagogue, mentally ill, unemployed, cold at night. Mm-hmm. What's going to happen?
Yeah. I mean, these are the hard cases. I mean, you can't have someone going around burning buildings down, but it doesn't look like the case of somebody who's deserving of retributive justice, right? This is someone who, I mean, it's a problem. Mental health care, incapacitating the person, I don't know, programs. It is a case that illustrates at least some of the considerations that don't make the retributive paradigm look very good. But that doesn't mean it's an easy problem to solve, We've got to do something. I don't know. What do we do?
All right. Hi. So my question is, do you think we should view justice first through the lens of morality or through what is legal? And how closely do you think those two correspond in today's society?
That's a good question. My approach has been to think of justice through the lens of morality, because I think it's helpful to construct justice as a kind of ideal that we're trying to move toward, and that we could use to criticize existing practices if they fall short of that ideal. and certainly there are many of them. It's helpful as a kind of as the basis of a critical stance to evaluate our institutional practices, including the law. But especially the law, if it aims toward justice, right? We need some independent notion of justice so we could evaluate whether the law is being successful. I think if we define justice in terms of actual legal practices, we lack the right kind of critical perspective from which to improve our society.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You mentioned earlier in the lecture this idea of justice as a form of education. I was wondering if you had any thoughts as to what that might look like in practical terms.
Well, I think one requirement of justice is education. It's good to be distributed to people. But I have a feeling that's maybe not what you're asking. You're asking more about how thinking about justice could be a form of education in itself?
Yeah. How,
Yeah. So I think both things. I think justice, I think education is an important requirement of justice, but I think reflecting on our values, both individually and as a society, can help us to be more thoughtful and self-aware people who are then able to think more clearly and thoughtfully about the problems that we're dealing with in our societies. So I think that, philosophizing about justice, for lack of a better term, could help us to be better problem solvers. So we can educate ourselves through the use of our own reasoning and reflection. And Plato thought that was like part of the good, that a good life involves that. It's a controversial idea. He said that unexamined life is not worth living. I wouldn't go that far. But he's saying something about the value of philosophy and using philosophical reasoning to think about questions of value as something that can help a person to develop and gain perspective and self-understanding. I hope that's some kind of answer to your question.
So going back to the mentally ill who committed a crime, and you're talking about them getting medication, treatment.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering how would that look like? Would they be in a prison setting, every day they're going to get treatment, or would they be going into a facility, get treatment, and then living in somewhere like a nursing home being looked after? Or how would that look like?
I think it's hard to answer that question in the abstract. I think there are going to be different kinds of cases. I think, people are working on alternatives to incarceration through the legal system, kind of diversionary programs. Some of the people in this room could speak to that issue in a more informed way more informatively to you than I could. But I think it's going to depend on the case and, the nature of the person's problems, how difficult it is to manage them, and how much of a threat the person poses to others, what crime they've committed. And I think there's going to have to be some element in a criminal justice system, not just of treatment, or getting people together, but of saying, look, what you did was wrong. There's an expressive function of the criminal justice system too, that is an important message to the victim to be acknowledged as the fact that their rights were violated or they've been abused illegally and unethically. It's kind of complicated to sort of weave together all the necessary elements and to try not to over-punish and to keep the possibility of reintegrating offenders back into society a real live issue and possibility. So I don't really have the answer, but I think it's worth thinking about.
Thank you.
I have a question about the Rawlsian stuff. And I'm just wondering about, so it sounds like that veil of ignorance depends on people's social positions being obscured from view.
Yes.
But the sort of distributive system gives priority to people who have been the most socially disadvantaged, who are at the low social positions. So I'm wondering if Rawls has a way of sort of reconciling those two things.
Yes, he does, yes.
Yeah, what is
Sure. So he thinks that behind a veil of ignorance, we're going to want to protect ourselves from the worst possible outcome, right? He doesn't think we're going to be big risk takers and say, okay, I'm going to like gamble away, sort of a guaranteed means for, establishing my welfare, and I'm going to gamble away my rights and liberties and go for a principle where, I have some chance of just like running away with the lion's share of the stuff, because he thinks that things like basic rights, liberty, and the means to lead a decent life are so important that we'll want to protect ourselves when the veil is lifted, to make sure that even if we end up as the worst off guy in society, given whatever inequalities are possibly justified, I'll be okay. I can accept that and feel a part of the society and not feel alienated and angry and, or suffer. So he argues that the two fit together, because behind the veil of ignorance, we will agree to that very principle, to protect those who are in the least well-off position, and that we can do that in a way where everybody can live well in a society in which there's the system of cooperation that is to everyone's benefit, right? But it's just any inequalities have to be justified from the perspective of those who are least well off. And he just thinks that's principle we would choose to protect ourselves, and because we want to live in a society, and I'm not saying everyone agrees, want to live in a society in which everyone feels included and like they're part of something good. We don't want to live in a society, he thinks, where you have some group of, people down at the bottom who are just miserable and alienated. Sure. So it's a certain vision of community, I think, that he thinks makes that choice rational. People may or may not agree with that, but it makes sense. It is an argument. It is an argument about how people would value different possible outcomes.
And I mean, since that's sort of, as you call it, a vision of community, do you think something like a veil of ignorance is actionable? Is it something that we could pull off?
He thinks we can pull it off in this sense. We can put ourselves imaginatively in that position, right? It's a thought experiment. It's a hypothetical position. And he thinks any of us can enter it at any time. All we have to do is think about it, right? And imagine, what we would find acceptable if we were in a social position other than our own. And some people say, well, I couldn't possibly do that. I can only think from my own perspective. But I think we can do it. I think we can go a long way to consider what things look like from standing in another person's shoes. And we don't have to actually be them in order to get some sense of what might be acceptable to them. Sure. We just have to understand something about their interests, their values, common needs, and such things. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Hi. I guess my question kind of has to do with the seemingly inherent, or rather like ingrained desire of humans to want to see punishment as a consequence for a wrongdoing. Mm-hmm. That when somebody becomes informed of a wrongdoing that enrages them, often the immediate response is to desire punishment for that wrongdoer.
Yeah.
And what suggestions would you make for changing this mindset in people? Yes.
I think actually we don't have to entirely change that mindset in order to accept that the role of our legal institutions doesn't have to embody it, right? We don't have to ask people never to feel anger and a desire for revenge. What we want to know is whether that should be the rationale for our criminal justice system and our practices of punishment. Maybe because people are inevitably going to feel these feelings and it can get out of control, that we need a different way of thinking about it institutionally, right? To keep other reasons that are important at the front of the discussion. I do think that there are also, people working on alternatives, like in a kind of in the moral psychology of retribution and revenge, to thinking about, practices of restorative justice, forgiveness. There are people that are developing alternative models, and some would argue that it's beneficial to people to be able to discharge their feelings of anger and move to a different, psychological experience vis-a-vis their own the harm that they've suffered and their relationship to the person who harmed them. But these are controversial models of ethical thinking that they are going to be the subject of controversy and disagreement. So while I would applaud those models, and I'm interested in exploring them myself, I'm not sure that we can institutionalize that thinking easily in the criminal justice system, but we do have alternatives to the retributive view that don't require that people engage in forgiveness or participate in restorative justice practices if they don't want to. So they seem like great options for some people, but maybe not the required position for our institutions to take. But I don't know, I think it's really worth thinking more about. I'm glad you asked.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So you mentioned that the justice system is more focused on punitive measures. You mentioned that the justice system is more focused on punitive measures rather than rehabilitation. What would you suggest to changing that within prisons and after they're released? And also, where would you draw the line, if you draw a line, of what is considered to be rehabilitable versus something that should be punished?
Well, I've been doing some work in prisons around education. I'm teaching philosophy in a prison, as Tom Morgan mentioned. And I think there's a lot of potential for education programs in prison to help people to gain a different perspective on themselves, on their past, to reflect and change in important ways and be better prepared to re-enter society, and with more internal resources, more psychological resources, and a clearer mind. So I think prison education can be an important part of, if we want to call it rehabilitation, or helping people to find a better way to live in society. I personally don't think anyone is beyond the pale of the possibility of change. I think people that have done really horrible things, however horrible those things are and that we want to condemn, might be someone who can change over time. There are people on death row who have undergone tremendous changes. It doesn't make what they've done forgivable or forgiven, but I think it's something that we can invest our faith in humanity in as a possibility, and that it kind of dehumanizes us if we think that it's not there for people to change and grow and move beyond being the worst thing that they've ever done, right? To be more than that. So so that's to answer the second part of your question. Yeah.
Thanks for your talk. I was thinking about the prison industrial complex while you were giving your lecture, and I wonder if you agree with Michelle Alexander's view that it is the new Jim Crow. And if so, how do we deal with the historical origins of our carceral society in addition to the philosophical underpinnings of it, which you discussed admirably, because I think we need to do both. And I don't know what John Rawls has to offer that necessarily.
I think you're right. He doesn't talk much about that problem. I think her work is important. I think I agree with a lot of it. I don't think it's a coincidence that we've witnessed an incredible spike in levels of incarceration just after the civil rights movement, when it seemed that there was a greater inclusion of African Americans in public life, and then all of a sudden they're being taken out of the public and shut away. So I think there's a lot to be said for her thesis, and I think that it's important. And I'd like to do more study of the history of carceral systems and in this country and their relationship to the practice of slavery. How some of the practice of, how some aspects of the history of slavery come back into the system, the prison system with prison labor, and kind of the idea of how the uncanny, I guess, resemblance of the felon and the slave in some important respects. The total control and extracted labor and all of this. So, it's a big topic, and I'm not the most knowledgeable on it about it, but I think it is important to look at, and it takes us to your question, which is, okay, well, we can't just talk about a kind of forward-looking effort to create justice in the future and move in the direction of justice. What about all the injustice in the past? How are we going to acknowledge that? Isn't part of our task to acknowledge and try to repair a history of, unjust abuses by being honest about them and maybe compensating, repairing, engaging in a reckoning with historical injustice as a condition of the possibility of moving forward. I think that's hugely important, and I'm very interested in that topic. And you're right, I didn't really talk about that, and it would be a good aspect of the subject to bring into a lecture like this.
Yeah, thanks for that. That's why, in part, my favorite philosopher is Walter Benjamin, who urged us to not dream of liberated grandchildren, but enslaved ancestors, in Theses on the Philosophy of History. So I look forward to seeing some of that work.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi. All right. So you look at the way the law has been manipulated multiple times to treat marginalized people different than the majority, and you see the injustice that is put on marginalized people in general. And I wanted to know if you think restorative justice would affect marginalized people the same as it would for the majority.
Well, I think it depends on how and where it's practiced. I think that my understanding, and I haven't studied this at length, there are other people in the room that could speak to this. Some practices of restorative justice as alternatives to putting people into the criminal justice system or incarcerating people are being offered in some communities and not in other communities. So it's driving a racialized inequality in the criminal justice system by adding the possibility for restorative justice practices in more advantaged communities as a way of keeping kids out of prison while that's not happening, in other jurisdictions and in the inner city and so on. I think that I think in practice we have to look out for unfairness in who and where it's offered and to whom. But I do think that potentially anyone could benefit if they're open to. Let me put it this way. I think many people in many different corners of society might be of a mind to want to engage in a restorative justice practice as a way of healing their own wounds and reckoning in an interpersonal way with what happened that includes the person who victimized them or their loved ones. I don't see that as of interest only to any particular group in society. So I think it could. Do you disagree? Or do you have a thought about it you want to share?
Honestly, I just wanted to know your perspective.
Yeah. I think it's a possibility and an interesting, attractive option that could be explored in many different communities.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Thank you very much for a wonderful talk.